Hello friends, the Bourbon Nerd here. Welcome to lesson 19 in my bourbon school. Today I'm going to talk about straight whiskey and it's going to be a relatively short lesson. So to help me through this episode, I am actually sipping on an Elmer T. Lee, a very nice Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. So cheers you all, and again, thank you so much for watching. Nice. So the topic of today is of course the word straight that you've probably seen on a number of whiskey labels. In this case, a Bulleit whiskey label, you've probably seen that a million times, but it has the word straight, and I'll go into the exact details on why it's on the label. So what I'll be covering today is I will cover the legal definition of straight. I'll also go a little bit into the various variations there are of straight whiskey. And then finally, I'll just cover very briefly my take on where this word straight originally came from. Okay, so the definition of straight whiskey, and sorry about this slide being really busy. I'm just going to cover it very quickly. The first one here is probably the most important one, is that in order to use the word straight on your label, you have to age the whiskey a minimum of 2 years. It also needs to come, all the whiskey in the bottle needs to come from the same state, with one exception, and I will cover that in a couple of slides. It also needs to, like most whiskeys out there, need to be aged in oak barrels. There's this one exception for corn whiskey, and we cover that in one of the first lessons as well. So, and also for straight, very importantly, is that you cannot add anything except water to the whiskey. So no coloring, no additives. If you have the word straight on the label, you cannot add anything to it. And then it can actually be combined with other whiskey types, meaning not only can you have a straight whiskey, you can also have a straight bourbon whiskey, and I'll also cover that. And as you can see, there's a little asterisk there on the definition because there are a few other rules, but they're super boring. And it's sort of how you have to lay out the label when it's a straight whiskey. I'm not going to cover that in this lesson. Also, and this thing about straight has to be aged for 2 years, it sort of adds to the already bit of confusion around the age statements for whiskey, because firstly, let's take bourbon. There are no age requirements for bourbon. I already covered this in lesson 10 if you want to go back and watch that. But then I suddenly introduced this 2-year minimum for straight whiskey, and then of course there are the other 4-year rules, as you can see here on the label. One is on the slide. One thing is that if your whiskey is less than 4 years old, you have to write it on the label. And also, if you want to call it bottle and bond, that's also another 4-year rule. So there's actually quite a few age rules involved here, which makes it a little bit difficult. And believe it or not, I will introduce one more age rule before this lesson is over. So at this point, I know it's a little bit confusing. Just think about the 2-year rule for straight whiskey. If it's a straight whiskey, it has to be aged for 2 years. There are also, as I said, quite a few variations of straight whiskey out there. So I found 7 here. I'm sure there are probably a few more, but these are probably the most well-known. So beside it has to be a straight whiskey. As I said before, you can also combine it with other types. So straight bourbon whiskey, straight rye whiskey, etc., etc., etc. And if you use both words, for instance, straight and bourbon, it has to adhere to both rules. So both the straight rules and the bourbon rules. And a good example is that, of course, a bourbon whiskey that has just been aged for 1 year is totally fine to call itself a bourbon, because there are no bourbon age rules for bourbon. But if you want to call it straight bourbon, it has to be 2 years. So that is one example here. And then I did mention when I said that all the whiskey has to come from the same state. There is one exception. And depending on how you interpret it, you can actually multiply all this different type with 2. Because if you add the words a blend of before the actual whiskey type, so a blend of straight whiskey or a blend of straight bourbon whiskey, then the whiskey can come from different states. But you have to indicate a blend of on your label, otherwise you'll not adhere to the rules. So here's a couple of examples. Here is a blend of straight bourbon whiskey from a manufacturer called Milam and Green. I have not tried this one. And there's also one which I'm much more familiar with from Smooth Ambler called a blend of straight rye whiskey. So in these cases, the whiskey comes from multiple states, and that's why you can actually that's why you have to call it a blend of. Okay, small variation there. And then, of course, there are variations on the state level. Of course, a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, for instance, comes from Kentucky. No surprise there. And the same goes, of course, with Tennessee and Iowa and Montana. And probably every one of the 50 states will have their own designation. I did find one rule, though, for Kentucky whiskey. So in order to call a whiskey for a Kentucky whiskey, it has to be aged for a minimum of 1 year. That was that one extra age rule that I talked about. I haven't found similar rules for the other states, so if you know about them, maybe you can leave a comment. That would be grateful. I know at least for Kentucky, you cannot call it Kentucky unless there's 1 year aging in the state. Okay. And then finally, as promised, why is it called straight? So the real answer is no one really knows. But I've been digging up a few sort of things that people think has been the original, sort of like theories, and I'll just tell them to you right now. So probably it is because it only contains a single whiskey type. So it's not a blend of this or that on the other, of course, unless it says a blend of. So that's why it's not been really mixed with other whiskey types. That's why it's called a straight whiskey. But there's also some theories that because it has sort of been aged continuously in a straight line without being interfered with, that's also why it's called a straight whiskey or straight bourbon. And then probably the last one, and you can say the chicken and the egg, what came first. It's also when you order a whiskey in a bar, they used to call it, I just need a whiskey straight. Today it's probably more neat, neat meaning without anything, not even ice. So that's sort of, it's become a little bit synonymous with the whiskey without anything. So because a whiskey without anything, as you remember, you cannot add anything except for water, by the way, then it's sort of called a straight whiskey. And that's also how it used to be ordered in bars and maybe to this day as well, even though neat is probably the most common term to refer to a whiskey without anything. So that's probably the top candidates. All right, that was lesson 19. Very short today, but also it's relatively easy to understand. So just remember this: a straight bourbon, straight rye, straight whatever it is, minimum 2 years, and it has to adhere to all the rules. And in a straight whiskey, you cannot add anything to it. So if you have a whiskey from somewhere where it says a rye whiskey and another part is called a straight rye whiskey, it's probably because they added stuff to the one that doesn't have the word straight on it. And regarding this stuff, I'll probably cover that in an upcoming lesson. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Take care. Cheers.